the policy is, although it's new, the issues in the policy are not new. And so let's look to what already exists from a legal perspective. So make sure you're compliant with POPI. Make sure you're compliant with PIA. Those are the bedrocks, really, of your compliance journey.
Good morning. My name is Chris Treasure. I'm speaking to you from ITWeb's Data and Cloud Summit 2024. And with me, I have Zwakili Mbanjwa. He's a data and tech lawyer from Mikkelson's. Thank you, Zwakili, for being here to chat to us.
Thank you, Chris.
I know you've just presented on the national policy on data and cloud, and there's a lot to take in. Perhaps I could just start by asking you, what are the main aspects of the policy that organizations and businesses need to be aware of?
Thanks, Chris. So I think four really come to mind. The first one would be the data localization and sovereignty, almost policy position, really speaking to how data and different types of data need to either stay in the country or the laws of South Africa need to follow the processing of that data. So I think that's the first big major one that's going to affect the operations of companies. The second big chunk of it is the privacy and cybersecurity considerations. I think this is an ordinary one, given the climate of data protection that we've really been in since the advent of POPI in our respect and GDPR in the greater respect. And so it's the same issues around cybersecurity, issues around the lawful processing of data. Then it is cross-border considerations. So I think that also is relevant from a data localization and sovereignty point of view. But I think what is exciting, at least for myself as a nerdy lawyer, is the guidance that we are anticipating from the information regulator around cross-border data transfers. And I think that's going to make the idea of moving information, and particularly personal information, from one place to another, particularly those of South African citizens, both juristic and natural persons, a bit more clearer. So those are really the big ones. And of course, there's the infrastructural aspect of it. But I think what's going to change, or rather what's going to impact the way that organizations do things, are really around those ones.
I'm with you. And I recall in your presentation, you made the distinction between a policy and law. There may be some people out there that are getting the two confused. If you have a policy in place, does it necessarily mean that you're obliged to follow the law? And the other converse applies, right? So what exactly is the policy there to do? Is it to ensure that a company or a business follows protocol in terms of these data-driven organizations? Can you maybe just explain the function of the policy?
Definitely. So a policy, and particularly a national policy, functions the same as when you think about an internal policy for an organization. It sets the tone for how the organization is meant to do something. So when you think about it within a broader context of this national data and cloud policy, it's setting the tone about how South Africa wants to really approach the its digital economy, specifically looking at data and cloud as the enablers of a digital economy. So when you look at the policy, it's there to say this is all the issues that we want to then deal with, because this is the direction that we're going on as a country. The direction is a cloud first direction. The direction is a data driven direction. The direction is a digital economy direction. So then what you'll see in the policy, it starts to tell you what policy proposals and interventions are. And this really is what the government is going to be looking to doing through either various government agencies or programs that they're going to be embarking on.
Right.
So you might see that the tone of laws that are going to come up and the tone of regulations that are going to come up will be to give life to some of the policy positions. So for example, if we're having a data localization conversation and the policy is saying, if you're going to be processing government data, and particularly sensitive government data, that's going to have to stay in the country, then there needs to be an empowering law that's going to do that. And of course, there's laws here and there from a piecemeal point of view, but you might see more proper direction, more assertive direction around those things. So the policy is there to say this is the framework, and then because there's existing laws, right? So this policy didn't come in a context where there are no other laws and no other directions, for example. So you've got PAPIA, you've got PAIA, you've got a cybersecurity bill, you've got different sector-specific legislations, you've got different regulations, you've got directives from the likes of your Department of Public Service and Administration, and those then become the arms of the policy.
I see. So the policy is sort of grounding all of those facets.
Yes.
And then that's how it gets operated on, that's how it gets sort of spread out into the market, so to speak.
100%. And it's important because it provides certainty, right? So you can almost use it for the government to account, because you can make what essentially publishing a policy means is that it provides some kind of certainty around when you're doing your business planning. You can plan based off of a policy position that the government has. So if, for example, we know that it's a policy position for government data to stay in the country, anyone providing, or rather sensitive government data to stay in the country, anyone providing services to the government, even though there might not be a strong law around that, can effectively plan for their operations to be able to meet that need from the government. So it's a very useful tool for organizations to use to plan. And always the anecdote or the joke is where how close to the policy the government will move, but it's very important for certainty. And I think within this climate of the GNU, this climate of collaboration, it becomes an important tool then for us to then, I guess, have a strategy on the digital economy.
So it may be premature to evaluate the policy. Really, it's pretty new, right? But do you foresee laws being produced or coming out as a result of this policy, new laws?
So before we get to new laws, I think it's making sure that the laws that we have are working well. So what I'm hoping to see is more guidance on the laws that we have. I mean, as I mentioned, the cross-border transfer guidance from the information regulator coming from a PAPIA perspective. So you might see some guidance from different other legislations. We're also looking at, we already have a cybersecurity bill, and information security and cybersecurity is very important for the object of the Act. And so we might then see that coming along. So I think before the new laws come into play, what I'm hoping to see is us becoming more rigorous around the existing laws, more guidance coming out of that, because we've got quite decent laws in place. So I'm not from the school of thought that says everything needs to be legislated, right? So over-regulation sometimes can stifle innovation. You just want to make sure that the right guardrails are in place so that the fundamental rights of data subjects and people are not harmed, and organizations as well from a PAPIA perspective. So I think, yes, we want to see more guidance on our existing laws, and if we are going to see new laws, those laws probably need to be more sector-specific, because I think there are more sector-specific issues that we need to be dealing with. And if we're going to see overarching laws, those need to bolster the existing laws that we have in PAPIA and PAIA and the Cybersecurity Act, not acts rather, but the Cybersecurity Bill. And then I think we're moving in a direction that gives life to the policy.
Okay, that really does make sense. You in your presentation, you also mentioned some of the realities in terms of challenges that the country is dealing with, specific industries are dealing with. How can the policy help to address those kind of challenges?
100%. So, if you think about our chief problems being unemployment, or rather maybe a large bucket of economic productivity. So economic productivity is one line item. Then the next line item becomes very specific issues like health, like food and nutrition, like access to financial services, and.
Right.
From an economic productivity point of view, what the policy has done is that it's almost positioned the digital economy as a strategic effort and a strategic growth driver for the South African economy, and underpinned us getting data and cloud right to power up the digital economy, and this is correct. So I think that's the first thing that the policy then does. Now, if you do these things properly, the policy then has certain call them interventions or proposals and considerations that it speaks to. One of them is around this access to government data, non-sensitive government data. Now, the possibilities of that then become endless, because if you have information on the number of schools in the Eastern Cape, for example, that don't have maths teachers, that then allows you to be able to strategically plan, and also new businesses can come up to solve those issues. So the moment government data becomes available, we can then start solving issues in a data-driven capacity. And I think that then becomes a really powerful thing and a powerful driver to then start realizing a South Africa promised in '94.
And it's a mindset aspect or issue, really, isn't it? It's a mindset issue from the authorities and government, and it's a mindset issue from the ordinary people that are using the data, and having them go in the same direction and for the same reason, right? And that's not always easy to do, but that's what you're aiming at. So when looking up on this policy, there was some misgivings reported about before the policy was drafted, and there was invitation for input from the public and input from the experts. There were some reservations and some issues that they hadn't pointed out. Do you know about that, and do you think that the policy as it stands has addressed all those concerns?
I think while I might not have an exhaustive list around them, some of those issues, for example, around classification, some of them are around infrastructure concerns, for example. I think at the time also we had, when the first draft came out of the policy, we hadn't seen what we've been experiencing for these couple of months around the stability of the grid, and Eskom in providing us with electricity, which is a very important thing for setting up a data center, for example, and particularly the performance of that data center based off of and its processing power based off of what you need out of it. When you think about AI, when you think about distributed ledgers and blockchains and the lot, those are high energy, requiring activities. So I think those were quite a few of those issues. And I think the other one also is really positioning the regulators right. I think the regulators are an important part of the conversation. And different regulators bring a different aspect to the conversation. When you're talking about an ICASA, you're talking about an communications infrastructure. When you're talking about an FPB, you're talking about a content, and that really becomes important in this advent of AI and IP and all those conversations. The information regulator becomes a key regulator, of course, within the context of the information age. And of course, other regulators like the Competition Commission in enabling in enabling competition within the space. There were talks around having a dedicated regulator for the digital economy, but I don't think we need one because coordinating around these regulators, coordination around these regulators, I think is the success factor. Bringing more regulators into the fore with the already constrained resources of the country might actually take away from our efforts instead of adding to our efforts.
That's an interesting point as well, because we talk about regulation and regulatory environments. How do you think South Africa compares to its African counterparts across the continent in terms of the level of regulation and how effective they are?
So we're pretty advanced, right? So we're top tier regulatory environment, particularly in providing some of those guardrails. I mean, when you think about which we were one of the first to have a data protection legislation on the continent, and then also to set up a regulator. And although our regulator has had an evolution and a journey to getting to a place where it is properly independent and properly able to do its job and its legislative mandate, it is working. We are reaching almost a year of the enforcement committee having been put in place, and we've seen quite a bit of action within that respect. And so that's really encouraging, I think. So when you look across the continent, different countries are struggling with different things, and different countries are concerned about different things, and data localization and sovereignty is a big theme around the things that are being that countries are worried about, as well as, I think, depending on which country you're in, registration. So making sure that people playing in the space are registered accordingly, whether they're registered as responsible parties in our language or controllers in more international language and processes, whether they are registered as people dealing with specific kinds of information, because really the priority of countries across the continent really with the varying enforcement ability and enforcement capacity is really to know which organizations are playing in the data space, for those organizations to know what data they're processing, so that the regulators are able to properly oversee those markets. And I think those are just the dynamics of the continent. When you're looking at the supervisory authorities, supervisory authorities, I think that's where the challenges really then creep up, because that is a resource conversation. So the supervisory authority is only as good as how resourced it is.
Right.
If you hear the story of the Mauritian a regulator, there used to be a one-woman shop. There's a one-woman shop, and she grew that department. She grew the regulator to what it is now, which is one of the more revered regulators on not only the continent but also in the world, because of just how forward-looking they are. So we're on our journey, but South Africa is actually in front of the pack, not behind.
That's interesting to know as well. I guess there's one other question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, in your presentation, you also provided some advice in terms of what steps businesses can take to adhere to the policy, and also then move towards compliance with the laws. Can you just give us a short synopsis of what kind of steps, what kind of advice would you give to businesses in terms of this policy?
Yeah, so I think it's also to contextualize that, although the policy, I think you've also mentioned it, Chris, is that the policy is, although it's new, the issues in the policy are not new. And so let's look to what already exists from a legal perspective. So make sure you're compliant with POPI. Make sure you're compliant with PIA. Those are the bedrocks, really, of your compliance journey. And from a PIA point of view, and I think this is the starting of a good data journey for any organization, ensure that you have a good record of your processing activities, and at least you have mapped out your high-risk processing activities. Because once you know what they are, then you know what measures you need to put in place. Papia, of course, says you need to do what's reasonably practicable in your circumstances, but you can't do what's reasonably practicable in your circumstances if you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
So the first thing is for you to know your processing activities, know your data, know how it's moving. And the conversation around knowing how it's moving is a conversation around who are your vendors that are your processors. Because in that instance, you might have vendors in country, vendors out of country. If they're out of country, are they in a market that is found to be adequate? Because from a South African and a Papia point of view, Papia doesn't want you to transfer information to a market or jurisdiction that has less protections for data subjects than South Africa has, for example. So you want to make sure that you have those things, but it all begins with a good record of processing activities, because from that record you're able to do certain assessments that are mandated by law, like a personal information impact assessment for any processing activities that are high risk that you're about to go on. You're able to do transfer impact assessments around any cross-border transfers that you then need to do. You're able to do vendor risk assessments, or when you're going to be using an operator or processor in more global language, to know what questions to ask your operators and your operators, so that you are then not found wanting if the regulator ever comes knocking at your door. Then the other part is ensure that you have good breach management, so good incident response. I think nobody's immune from an incident, and the ask isn't necessarily to have zero incidents within your environment. That is the dream.
Yes.
But the idea is that you're able to detect. Number one, you have preventative measures in place, but then you're able to detect when an incident takes place, security compromise takes place, there's unauthorized access that's taking place, that you're able to respond effectively by way of understanding what exactly took place, create a mitigation plan, and then let the regulator know in time. Especially based off of whatever personal information has been affected, and not just the regulator, but the data subjects that are that are affected as well. So it's really about doing what's already been asked for us to do over the past couple of years. That means that you're on, I think, the right side of the policy, just from a regulatory perspective. And then from an investment perspective, ensuring that you're investing in your people, that you're training people up to make sure, because if you have a trained workforce, that makes the organization more resilient to these turbulent turns of the digital economy. So I think really that's the crux of it.